Hello.
We'll get you some better.
Yeah, well, this talk grew out of a symposium where actually Michael Friedman had written about my big book. And then in answer, I actually, rather than particularly talking about my book, wanted to draw out some sorts of what the title says. I think, and this is connected with the comment I had that I think that 20th century philosophy of science overemphasized logical structure as opposed to other sorts of inferential reasoning in understanding how science develops. And so really my kind of underlying moral is, it doesn't so much show up in the talk, but to understand what's going on in the development of physics, we need to use a lot more of the incredibly wonderful tools that the modern theory of differential equations has given us to tell you how one kind of equation or way of dealing with a problem relates to another. And there's a lot of beautiful fine-grained structure there, and that's what, and I think the philosophy of science still tended to rely too much on what I call the theory T signal. So, anyway, these issues sort of came up with Michael, and he's has some things to say from his neo-Kantian perspective. So, anyway, so now in this sense, both of our, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Michael's book than mine, but anyway, about a little difference that shows up there. But both of us agree, I guess, sort of very much with what Ladyman and Ross said about that something's really gone dreadfully wrong in contemporary philosophical thinking. And we believe that analytic philosophy should recharge itself by visiting the themes of the scientific philosophy past. Michael, the 20th century, well, both of us agree that the late 19th century is a great period, and that's the one I favor over the 20th century. And through the neglect of the original motive, actually what I want to say is we really need to go back and rethink the problems that motivated the great philosopher physicists in the latter part of the 19th century, and which were carried on by the positivists and so forth. But we've forgotten a lot about the actual problems that motivated their thinking, okay? And I think that there's a lot to learn by seeing what science has done since and to revisit those original problems. And that's one of the things I do try to do, among other things, in my book, revisit the problems that bothered Heinrich Hertz and the principles of mechanics. Anyway, there's some disagreements, a lot of disagreement in rhetoric. Michael sort of is a neo-Kantian, and I tend to be a scientific realist of some ill-defined nature. And but these disagreements grow out of somewhat different appraisals of where the true merits of our scientific philosophy heritage lie. So I'm going to try to diagnose this difference, which I think is worth bringing to the fore, so we can. And this is what I said at the outset, that eventually a lot of this revolves around the question of the role of logic when we're thinking about science. Okay, now one of the things I was trying to do in Wandering Significance, spends a lot of pages, is criticize the sort of classical thinking about concepts that I think that Bertrand Russell captured quite well in Problems of Philosophy. I think that many of these underlying tenets still dominate philosophy. Okay. Now one thing I didn't somehow make clear because of the way I wrote the book, is the whole scientific philosophy movement, even going back to Kant or before, has always been, in some way or another, recognized that this sort of naive classical conception of conceptual content is a hindrance to the free creativity of the science. And one of the major things that Michael did in his review of my book is just highlight the degree to which this was true among the positivists. And somehow I didn't register that I understood that in my book well enough. Okay. And in particular, the scientific, well, what Michael does in his nice little book is that he is criticizing present-day philosophy for its conceptual timidity. And he observed that nowadays it rarely serves as a fierce enemy of ideological complacency as it did in the glory days of scientific philosophy. Okay? We get this idea that somehow there's a conceptual realm or various conceptual realms, and the philosopher is some sort of botanist that tries to put this in tidy order. Ross and Wakeman wrote critically about this sort of conception of things. But originally, the motivations for needing a different view of concepts is a search for greater conceptual liberty within science. Okay, and as what we well know, and Michael's historical work is great at laying this out, is the pressures within geometry. Something had to change, and in particular, the rise in non-Euclidean geometry, so that's Poincaré tessellation. Okay, and a lot of Michael's book is concerned with, and I agree with very much with the emphasis he places on this topic, of the importance in moving science along conceptually, the role that the great thought experiments of Helmholtz, Poincaré, and all those played in allowing science to change. Okay, so the scientific philosophy movement, we do need to understand, arose from a desire to liberate this free creativity of the scientists. That's a common phrase in 19th century literature, from what Gauss called the complaints of the believers, right? But now, what does free creativity mean? How do we understand it? How do we justify it? And that sort of takes us into almost philosophy of concepts formation. Okay, well this I'm going to kind of go over because I suppose a lot of us sort of agree this. Most contemporary students of concepts now seem totally oblivious to the real life problems of conceptual development that inspired the scientific philosophy movement. And that's what one of the things that Michael in his book is trying to get us to stop doing. Okay, but contemporary scholars don't see anything semantic in any of Michael's examples, just a bunch of guys shifting meanings of distance and time. So stuff happens, let's get back to concentrating on dog and doorknob. And when I put those pictures up, there is a resemblance. Okay, here's how Michael formulates this. I can't remember whether this is from the book itself or from his review of my book. But modern analytic philosophy clings to the idea of a specially characteristic philosophical enterprise of mere conceptual possibilities inherited from the analytic tradition, but completely ignoring the distinctive conception of logic which made this tradition possible in the first place. Okay. And then he actually blames Klein for a lot of this, and what is justice to it? Okay. Anyway. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is quickly outline how the positivists wanted to deal with this issue of how can we look at concepts in such a way to encourage greater conceptual liberty in the prosecution of science. And the basic idea is he thought that scientific concepts could be supplied with adequate meaning simply through inclusion within a properly articulated theoretical frame that would implicitly define the terminology. Familiar idea.